Officers, Mr. Reed, we must secure the perimeter immediately.
Understood.
We'll start the patrols now.
The team is ready.
Officers, check that area, now.
Yes, ma'am. I saw movement over there.
Go, we'll follow. The records show discrepancies in the last quarter.
We'll need to verify the entries. I can show you the logs.
Good.
If you've ever lived near an HOA, you already know how this kind of story begins. It starts with a clipboard, a badge that isn't a badge, and someone who believes authority is a personality trait. I own a vineyard on the rural edge of the county, just outside the boundary line of a gated development called Oak Ridge Estates. The place markets itself like it's a cross between Napa Valley and a luxury retirement brochure, but it's really just oversized houses, uniform mailboxes, and a homeowners association with a CEO who treats bylaws like sacred scripture. My vineyard predates Oak Ridge Estates by almost 30 years. The land has been in my family since my grandfather planted the first vines by hand. When the developers carved out Oak Ridge from what used to be open pasture land, they built right up to the old stone fence that marks my property line. That fence isn't decorative. It's on the county plat maps. It's surveyed. It's filed. It's older than their entire subdivision, which is why it was surreal to pull up to my own gate one Tuesday morning and find two men in matching navy polo shirts standing beside a white SUV with magnetic decals that read, Oak Ridge Estates HOA Compliance and Security Division. They weren't sheriff's deputies. They weren't code enforcement. They were what I later learned the HOA president liked to call HOA officers. Around here, most people just call them what they are, clipboard cops. They had a folding table set up just inside my open gate, on my vineyard. The taller one was taking photos of my tractor. The other was placing bright orange notices on the posts of my fence. From the road, it looked like my property had been condemned. I pulled in slowly, partly confused and partly trying to figure out whether this was some kind of elaborate prank. But there was nothing playful about the way they looked at me when I stepped out of my truck. They carried themselves with that particular blend of smugness and borrowed authority, the kind that comes from being told you're in charge of something small and deciding it makes you important. They informed me, in the tone of men delivering a citation, that Oak Ridge Estates had received multiple complaints regarding unsightly agricultural equipment, non-compliant fencing, and possible commercial activity that violated community standards. I let that sink in for a moment. Community standards. I asked them which community they thought they were standing in. They gestured vaguely behind them toward the manicured entrance of Oak Ridge Estates. They explained that the vineyard directly impacts the aesthetic integrity of their development and that under Section 14.3 of their covenants, the HOA had the authority to mitigate external nuisances affecting property values. I've dealt with enough bureaucracy to know when someone is reciting language they barely understand. They handed me a printed notice of violation. It had my name misspelled. It cited an address that didn't exist, and at the bottom, it listed fines that would begin accruing in 72 hours if the violations were not corrected fines against a property that was not, has never been, and will never be part of Oak Ridge Estates. I told them plainly that my land was outside their jurisdiction. The boundary line is literally a stone fence you can see from space. The county tax assessor's office has my parcel listed as agricultural, not residential. I pay no dues. I sign no covenants. I never agreed to anything involving Oak Ridge Estates. They responded by informing me that the HOA's CEO, a woman named Denise Calder, had expanded enforcement efforts to protect the investment of homeowners. That was my first introduction to Denise. Apparently, in her mind, the mere existence of my vineyard, tractors, grape trellises, wind machines, and all, was a threat to her property values. While they were explaining this to me, one of them continued photographing my equipment as if documenting evidence in a crime scene. The other stuck another orange notice to my fence, this one warning of escalated enforcement measures. I asked them if they had any authority granted by the county. They didn't answer directly. They said the HOA had retained legal counsel. That was when the irritation turned into something sharper, because there's a difference between overstepping and trespassing, and these two weren't standing on the other side of the fence. They were on my gravel drive 50 feet from my barn. I informed them that they were on private property and needed to leave. They exchanged a look, the kind that says they were not used to being told no. They didn't leave. Instead, one of them began explaining that failure to comply would result in lien proceedings. A lien on land they have zero claim to. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just neighborhood pettiness. This was an HOA drunk on its own authority, testing how far it could push someone it assumed wouldn't push back. I took out my phone and stepped aside. If they wanted to pretend to be law enforcement, I was about to introduce them to the real thing. And that's when the day went from ridiculous to unforgettable. The sheriff's department was about to enter the Vineyard, and Denise Calder's OA cops had no idea what was coming next. If you've ever watched someone bluff their way through a power trip, you know there's a very specific moment when confidence turns brittle. It's subtle at first, a tightening jaw, a shift in posture, a glance toward the exit. That moment arrived about 12 minutes after I called the sheriff's department. The two Oak Ridge estates, Compliance and Security Division, officers were still standing in my gravel drive, one holding his clipboard like a shield, the other pretending to review photos on his phone. They had stopped posting notices but hadn't removed the ones they'd already stapled to my fence. Bright orange warnings fluttered in the breeze over grapevines that had been there longer than their subdivision's decorative fountain. When the patrol vehicle from the county sheriff's office rolled up the drive, dust trailing behind it, the atmosphere changed instantly. The deputy who stepped out wasn't dramatic. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He adjusted his hat, took in the scene. The SUV with magnetic OA decals, the folding table, the orange notices, and then looked at me. I explained calmly that these men were on my property issuing fines under the authority of a homeowners association I was not part of. I pointed to the old stone boundary fence, visible from where we stood. I mentioned the parcel number, the agricultural zoning, the fact that Oak Ridge Estates begins precisely where my land ends. The deputy nodded. Then he turned to the two men. And that's when the unraveling began. They launched into a polished explanation about nuisance mitigation authority and community impact enforcement. They referenced their CEO, Denise Calder, and claimed the HOA had the right to protect property values from external threats, as if my grapevines were planning an invasion. The deputy asked a very simple question. Did they have any legal documentation granting them enforcement authority over property outside Oak Ridge Estates? Silence. They shifted tactics. They said their legal counsel advised them they could notify adjacent landowners of violations affecting HOA members. The deputy clarified that notifying someone and entering their property without permission were two very different things. He asked if they had been invited onto my land. Again, silence. That was when he requested identification. Not because he didn't believe they worked for the HOA. The matching polos and the SUV made that obvious. But because once you step onto private property and start posting documents threatening fines and liens, the situation stops being a neighborhood disagreement and starts edging toward criminal trespass. You could see it in their faces. The confidence that had fueled their earlier performance drained away. The clipboard lowered. The tone softened. They tried to argue that the gate had been open. The deputy explained that an open gate is not an open invitation. They tried to suggest they were performing a civic duty. He informed them that impersonating law enforcement, even indirectly, through uniforms and vehicle markings that create the impression of official authority, is not a civic duty. And then came the sentence that shifted the balance completely. He told them they were to remove every notice they had posted, pack up their equipment, and leave immediately. If they returned without the property owner's consent, they would be cited for trespassing. No debate, no negotiation, just clarity. They peeled the orange notices off my fence one by one. The wind had already started to loosen the staples, and I watched as they struggled to remove the last of them without tearing the wood. The folding table disappeared into the back of their SUV. The magnetic decals suddenly looked less official and more like something printed at a strip mall. Before leaving, the deputy advised me to document everything, take photos, save the notices. If the OA attempted further action, especially talk of liens, I should contact the county attorney's office immediately. As the SUV rolled down my drive and back toward Oak Ridge Estates, I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because people who build their identity around authority don't handle public correction well. And Denise Calder, the self-appointed guardian of Oak Ridge property values, had just been embarrassed. The Vineyard might have been quiet again that afternoon, but across the stone fence a storm was brewing. If you think getting escorted off private property by a sheriff's deputy would humble an HOA leadership team, you've clearly never met someone who introduces herself as a CEO of a homeowners association. 3 days after the Vineyard incident, I received a certified letter. Not from a court, not from the county, from Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, signed personally by Denise Calder, CEO. The envelope alone was theatrical. Heavy cardstock, embossed logo, the kind of packaging designed to imply seriousness. Inside was a 6-page letter citing sections of Oak Ridge's covenants, conditions and restrictions as though I had ever agreed to be bound by them. Denise's argument had evolved. She was no longer claiming direct enforcement authority over my land. Instead, she asserted that my vineyard constituted a private nuisance that materially affected the enjoyment and property values of Oak Ridge residents. The letter referenced early morning tractor noise, seasonal frost control fans, and the industrial appearance of agricultural equipment visible from certain second-story balconies. Industrial. We're talking about a red tractor and grape trellises. The most audacious part came near the end. Denise demanded that I engage in good faith negotiations to construct a visual mitigation barrier along the shared boundary line at my expense, consisting of mature evergreen trees of a specified height, spaced according to HOA design standards. In other words, she wanted me to build them a privacy wall so her homeowners wouldn't have to look at the vineyard that existed long before their subdivision brochure ever hit a printer. And then there was the veiled threat. If I failed to cooperate, the HOA would pursue all available legal remedies. I've lived in this county long enough to recognize bluff wrapped in legal vocabulary. But I also know when someone is trying to build a paper trail, so I made a visit to the county planning office. I brought parcel maps, zoning documents, and a copy of Denise's letter. The planner on duty barely made it halfway through before shaking his head. My vineyard was zoned agricultural decades before Oak Ridge Estates was approved. The subdivision plans explicitly acknowledged adjacency to active farmland. There were even disclosures in Oak Ridge's original development filings warning future homeowners about potential farm noise and seasonal operations. In other words, anyone who bought a house there had been told, in writing, that they were moving next to a working vineyard. Armed with that information, I sent a concise response to Denise. I cited the zoning protections under the State's Right to Farm Act. I included copies of the county approvals. I reminded her that agricultural operations are legally shielded from nuisance claims when they predate surrounding residential development. I kept the tone professional. No insults, no sarcasm, facts only. Her reply came faster this time, and it wasn't a letter. It was a social media post. Oak Ridge Estates has a private residence group page, and somehow screenshots of Denise's post made their way to me. In it, she described an uncooperative neighboring landowner who refused to work with the community to maintain property values. She framed the sheriff's intervention as a misunderstanding and portrayed herself as defending homeowners from encroaching commercial interests. Encroaching. My vineyard hasn't moved in 30 years. But this wasn't about land anymore. It was about image, about authority challenged in public. Denise wasn't backing down, she was rallying her base. And then I started noticing something else. SUVs from Oak Ridge slowly driving past my gate, residents stopping to take photos from the road. Someone had placed small wooden stakes just inches inside my side of the stone fence, as if testing whether I'd notice. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stay at the level of certified letters and Facebook posts. The HOA wasn't done, and Denise Calder had decided that if she couldn't find me, she'd find another way to apply pressure. What she didn't realize was that the county had been watching her escalation too, and the next move wouldn't come from me. There's something uniquely insulting about someone testing your property line with wooden stakes. Not big, obvious fence posts. Not a formal survey marker with official tags. Just thin, hardware store stakes nudged into the soil like quiet little flags claiming territory by suggestion. I pulled 3 of them out along the old stone fence one Saturday morning. Each had fluorescent tape tied at the top. They weren't random. They were placed at measured intervals, running parallel to the boundary line, which meant this wasn't a bored resident wandering too close to the edge of their yard. This was coordinated. I called the county surveyor's office that afternoon. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked whether any survey permits had been filed recently for parcels inside Oak Ridge Estates bordering my land. There had been, requested by Oak Ridge Estates OA. That's when things clicked into place. Denise wasn't trying to find me anymore. She was trying to redraw the battlefield. 2 days later, a licensed survey crew showed up, this time with an actual county permit number. They stayed on the Oak Ridge side of the fence, which I appreciated, but I watched closely as they worked. Tripods went up. Laser levels blinked in the morning light. Measurements were called out and written down. By mid-afternoon, one of the surveyors walked over to the fence line and frowned. He measured again, then again. Finally, he waved over his colleague. I walked down the rows of vines toward them, staying on my side. They didn't look like men enjoying their assignment. The older of the two explained that according to the original subdivision plat for Oak Ridge Estates, the boundary line matched the existing stone fence almost exactly, but not perfectly. In 3 small sections totaling about 40 feet, the fence actually sat a few inches inside my property line. In other words, for decades my family had effectively given Oak Ridge a sliver of land without realizing it. It was minor inches, barely enough to matter agriculturally, but legally, it mattered, and Denise knew it. By the end of the week, another certified letter arrived. This one informed me that the HOA intended to reclaim encroached common area and would be installing a uniform privacy fence along the true boundary line as determined by the recent survey. They weren't asking permission to build on my property. They were planning to build inches away from my vines, effectively boxing in sections of my irrigation lines and restricting access for maintenance equipment. It was petty. It was strategic, and it was designed to provoke. But here's what Denise hadn't counted on: the concept of adverse possession. The stone fence had been there for nearly 3 decades, maintained by my family, treated by both parties as the de facto boundary. In this state, long-standing, uncontested use of a strip of land can shift legal rights over time. So before any construction equipment rolled in, I hired a real estate attorney. Within days, Oak Ridge Estates received a formal notice asserting a claim over the disputed strip based on continuous and open use. My attorney requested mediation before any alterations were made. That's when the temperature spiked, because Denise didn't just respond through counsel. She scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting and invited residents to attend. And this time, she didn't frame it as nuisance mitigation. She framed it as a land grab. According to the agenda that circulated online, the meeting would address defending community property from external appropriation. External appropriation. Over a few inches of dirt no one had cared about for 30 years. But Denise wasn't fighting over land anymore. She was fighting for control of the narrative. And the night of that board meeting, the Oak Ridge Clubhouse was standing room only, with one unexpected guest sitting quietly in the back row. Me. If you've never attended an HOA emergency board meeting, imagine a courtroom with no judge, no rules of evidence, and a microphone that somehow makes everyone braver than they should be. Oak Ridge Estates Clubhouse was packed that night. Folding chairs lined the walls. Homeowners clutched printed copies of the survey diagram like they were preparing for trial. At the front of the room sat Denise Calder, perfectly composed, a binder of documents stacked in front of her like ammunition. She had the posture of someone certain she was about to win. The meeting opened with a presentation. Slides projected onto a screen showed aerial maps of the subdivision, zooming in dramatically on the thin strip of land along the stone fence. Denise described it as misappropriated common area. She emphasized fiduciary duty, property value protection, and the board's obligation to reclaim what belongs to the community. She never once mentioned that the misappropriation measured only inches. Then she pivoted. She referenced the Vineyard as an expanding commercial operation that had been unwilling to collaborate. She reminded residents about tractor noise and frost control fans, carefully framing ordinary agricultural activity as encroachment. There was applause. That's when I stood up. I hadn't planned to speak. But when your family's land is described like a hostile takeover, staying silent stops being polite and starts being surrender. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply introduced myself as the owner of the vineyard next door, the one that existed long before Oak Ridge Estates was approved. The room shifted. It's easy to vilify someone when they're abstract. Harder when they're standing 10 feet away. I laid out the timeline, the agricultural zoning, the original subdivision disclosures warning buyers about adjacent farmland. I explained that the stone fence had been treated as the boundary by both parties for decades, that my family had maintained it, that irrigation and vine placement had relied on that understanding. Then I mentioned something Denise had conveniently omitted: the state's right to farm protections. Several residents began flipping through their documents. I also clarified that my attorney had already filed a notice asserting adverse possession over the disputed strip. that any attempt to build a fence without resolving the claim would likely result in a court injunction, and legal fees borne not just by the board, but by the HOA's membership. The word fees travels fast in a room full of homeowners. Denise attempted to regain control, insisting the board was acting in everyone's best interest. But the tone had shifted. Hands went up, questions were asked, pointed ones. Why hadn't residents been told about the farm disclosures when they purchased? How much would litigation cost? Was this really about inches of land? One homeowner asked whether the sheriff's department had been called to the Vineyard the week before. That detail hadn't been part of Denise's presentation. When pressed, she described it as a miscommunication, but the phrasing sounded thinner now. The meeting stretched past 2 hours. By the end, the confident applause from the beginning had dissolved into uneasy murmurs. The board voted, narrowly, to postpone fence construction pending further review. Postpone, not cancel, but it was a crack. As residents filed out, a few approached me quietly, not to apologize, not exactly. More to ask questions, to confirm facts, to understand what they hadn't been told. Denise remained at the front of the room, binder closed, jaw tight. She had expected a rally. Instead, she'd sparked doubt. But power rarely retreats gracefully. And 3 days later, Oak Ridge Estates made a move that escalated the conflict beyond meetings and surveys. Because the next letter didn't come from Denise. When the attorney's letter arrived, it was thicker than the others. Heavy paper, formal letterhead, the kind of envelope designed to make you feel like you've already lost. Oak Ridge Estates had officially retained outside counsel. The letter accused me of unlawful encroachment, interference with community property, and intimidation tactics. At the board meeting, it demanded immediate acknowledgement of the surveyed boundary and warned that failure to comply would result in litigation seeking damages and injunctive relief. It was dramatic. It was aggressive, and it was carefully written to scare someone who didn't understand how land law works. Fortunately for me, I did, and so did my attorney. Within 48 hours, a response went out dismantling every claim. We attached historical aerial photos showing the stone fence in place long before Oak Ridge's first foundation was poured. We included maintenance records, irrigation plans, and affidavits from neighboring landowners confirming decades of uncontested use. We cited the state's right to farm statute again, emphasizing that agricultural operations predating residential development are shielded from nuisance claims. And then we added something new. A formal complaint filed with the county regarding harassment and repeated attempts by HOA representatives to assert authority beyond their jurisdiction. Because while Denise had tried to reframe the story as a property line correction, there was still the matter of her, cops, trespassing on my land and issuing fraudulent fines. The county took that part seriously. A week later, a sheriff's deputy, the same one who had escorted the compliance officers off my vineyard, attended an Oak Ridge board meeting at the county's request, not as security, as clarification. From what I later heard from multiple residents, the room was tense before he even spoke. He didn't lecture. He didn't threaten. He simply stated facts. Oak Ridge Estates had no legal authority over properties outside its recorded boundaries. Any further attempts to enter my land, post notices, or represent enforcement powers could result in citations for trespassing or, depending on presentation, impersonation concerns. Civil disputes over boundary lines belonged in court, not in driveways with magnetic decals and clipboards. Then he addressed something Denise had repeatedly danced around. Knowingly misrepresenting jurisdiction to homeowners could expose the association to liability. That landed, because this was no longer about vines or fences. It was about risk, legal risk, financial risk, personal liability for board members who overstepped. Within 2 weeks, the HOA attorney requested mediation. The tone had changed entirely. The demand letters disappeared. The talk of damages evaporated. Instead, they proposed a practical solution, acknowledged the historical fence line as the functional boundary, and draft a mutual easement agreement clarifying maintenance responsibilities without relocating anything. In other words, leave it alone. The mediation session itself was uneventful. No raised voices, no theatrics, just paperwork formalizing what had effectively been reality for decades. Denise attended but spoke very little. Shortly after the agreement was signed, Oak Ridge residents received an email announcing that Denise Calder had stepped down as CEO to pursue other opportunities. The HOA would be restructuring its enforcement policies and dissolving the so-called Compliance and Security Division. The magnetic decals disappeared from the SUV. The orange notices never returned. The vineyard remained exactly where it had always been, Rows of grapes stretching under open sky, tractors humming at sunrise, frost fans turning when the temperature dipped. Occasionally, I still see Oak Ridge residents walking along their side of the stone fence. Some wave now, some even stop by during harvest season to buy a bottle. Because here's the thing about HOA power plays, they work best in silence. The moment someone calls in the real badge, the illusion cracks. Denise tried to police land she didn't own. The sheriff reminded her, calmly, publicly, and permanently, that authority has boundaries, and unlike HOA bylaws, those boundaries are actually enforceable.